two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Maddie Halpert. Maddie Halpert recently ran for Common Council on the Solidarity Slate in Ithaca's first ward. Maddie, what was the point of the Solidarity Slate? What was it about?
First, I'll kind of start by tweaking your question a little bit. And not putting it in the past tense, but saying what is the Solidarity Slate and what is it all about? Because we are, very much still in action, and that's, I think, a big part of the point is that it's not just about leading up to an election day, right? It's a whole grassroots community organizing process. One of my co-candidates, who is now an alderperson-elect in Ward 2, Phoebe Brown, calls it a new way of politicking. That's how she kind of sums up the Solidarity Slate. And I think for me, what that kind of really comes down to is a lot about changing the relationships, what relationships look like around elections and around local government. And, sometimes that means that we need kind of to invent new words, like the idea of being co-candidates. So like I said, it was Phoebe in Ward 2. Jorge DeFendini is now the alderperson-elect in Ward 4. And so the three of us, kind of coming as community organizers, and Naya Foster, who was the original Ward 1 candidate, it's this idea of having multiple candidates in different parts of the city that had elections happening simultaneously, and having these candidates with a shared platform. So with a shared set of values for the kinds of changes that we need to see in our city. And I think, that's ultimately what's kind of at the heart of it, is shifting away from the way that elections are usually, kind of so centered on one person and saying this person, has all the answers, has all the experience, but shifting towards something that's more about collective community building, collective processes. And then I think it's also about carrying forward those relationships and changing the way that, we relate between people who are in office and the whole community. What does it mean to be represented? What does it mean to be a representative? So shifting towards, models where we have community-driven processes like people's assemblies, people getting together, in neighborhoods or gathering people from across the city to say, here are the questions we need to be asking each other about what the rules look like in our city. And then having that relationship, really being able to communicate with the people who are in office, actually being receptive, from a different perspective of having come from all of that community organizing work. And yeah, I said there was a debate that we had in Ward 1. And one of the things that I said too, what is the slate? What are we about? I think that we're kind of a collective affirmation that there's so many visions and changes, that are possible for our community if we make those things happen together.
So it's about getting the community, making sure that the community is involved.
Yes, absolutely, every step of the way.
But I think actually you did it in a fairly, what's considered old-fashioned way, namely a lot of going door to door.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that personally drew me into the slate, was wanting to learn about organizing door-to-door work, wanting an excuse to talk to my own neighbors, honestly.
So I guess I should actually say, full disclosure, I was working for the Solidarity Slate at various times for all three candidates. a lot for you and, well, first for Shania, for Naya in the first ward, because we
Totally.
figured that was the hardest race. And
Yeah, absolutely.
then later also for Jorge DeFendini in the fourth ward where I live. But
Yeah,
we should
and
probably describe the wards and the who, where there was an opening and why people were running.
So Ward 1, I know the best and the most in-depth at this point. So it is West Hill that's in the city, and then it sweeps across part of the flats, kind of around Nate's Floral Estates and a little bit of the West End, and then sweeps across all of South Hill that's in the city. There's actually a little sliver, one half of East State Street over on East Hill. So that's Ward 1. And then Ward 2 is most of the downtown area. Ward 3 is up kind of Bell Sherman area over on East Hill. Ward 4 is right around College Town, and Ward 5 is the Fall Creek area. And so in this election cycle, there was one position up for election across each of the wards. And so we had candidates this time running in, like I said, Ward 1, where it was a race against an incumbent common council member who has been in office for 10 years. And then in Wards 2 and 4, those were both uncontested in the primary. So both of those candidates ended up on both the Democratic and Working Families Party lines. And they both had independent challengers in the general election that they were contesting against, I suppose.
Those second and fourth wards are what we call open seats, because in each of those, the incumbent had decided, for whatever personal reasons, not to run again.
Totally.
Yeah, in the fourth ward here, it's been Graham Kerslick, and in the second, Seth Murtaugh.
Yes. And I would love to jump back to a little bit on the door knocking topic, if I might, because first of all, thank you to you specifically, but also to just everybody who came out and volunteered, door knocking, phone banking, all of that stuff. That is, like I said, so much of the heart of the campaign. And we had a system where we would always go out in pairs when we were door knocking. And I think that's just so worth it because, it really is about like the camaraderie and about kind of getting to know each other as we're volunteering, and share, be able to support each other in that process and learn from each other. And I think it really, kind of demonstrates and brings a really nice atmosphere to those conversations. And that is something that, I feel really proud about for all of us in this campaign work, is I think that being in those tough conversations with our neighbors is something that was such a big part of the process. And being able to, openly share our values, but also engage with and learn with every single person who we talk to. Because I feel like sometimes in Ithaca, we can be so geographically close to each other and yet not actually communicate very often. And so I think through that door knocking, not only were we learning so much about people's experiences across Ithaca, but also we were able to, hear from people what they're going through and connect people directly to different types of mutual aid services and to different, organizations. Like if they were having something about, needing to know tenants' rights, like connect them with those resources and stuff like that. And, one of my fellow volunteers and we talked to somebody living in Nate's Floral Estates, which is down on the flats. And he told us that he's been registered Republican all his life, but that in Ithaca, often he doesn't get a chance to vote for a Republican candidate. So he feels like he just has to vote for whoever he thinks is listening to people and is going to do the most good. And that, based on the conversation that we had, he said that he was planning to vote for us. And I asked, what his experience has been like with different representatives in office over time. And he said, like, he's never heard from, he didn't know who was in office now. He hadn't really heard of, most of the people who have represented him or that kind of thing. And I think a lot of the sort of conventional election wisdom about talking to the people who are registered Democrats and the most likely voters and things like that. I think often there's a lot of people who are left out in so many different directions, and that's like one example. One example, but there's, lots of people who, maybe haven't felt moved to vote in other cases, or maybe they still weren't planning to vote, but just were able to share their experiences where they were living. And like I said, so many conversations where we connected people to things. And so I think, it's given me a lot to think about for sure. Yeah, door knocking, where it's at.
In fact, just a little clarification, because you've a couple of times mentioned Nate's Floral Estates. That's down near the inlet. It's the one trailer park in the city of Ithaca. I think typically seniors live there.
Yes,
that's my impression. I mean, I know a number of people who live there, and they are all probably could be considered seniors. And you didn't run into children, did you, when you were there?
No, but lots of deer.
Okay, you described the first ward, which I guess is pretty diverse. I mean, there are some very different parts to it, which I imagine have some very different politics.
Yep. I mean, I think a lot is very kind of neighborhood level, both in terms of places where you see more tenants versus homeowners, places where you see more people of color, but also, and I mean, not that any of those things have to dictate people's politics, because people are diverse and have diverse experiences. But, I think with something like tenancy, I do think that there's a lot that folks have in common along those lines. And then, the other part of it is that so much of it is, neighborhood concerns, because city government really does work on a lot of things that are neighborhood specific. And, this is something that was interesting in having conversations with people because this was the first time that we did a Solidarity Slate kind of approach, or having these candidates on a common platform in Ithaca. I think that in some ways, it feels kind of experimental. And also I think that there's a lot about just kind of introducing that concept to people, and also hearing people's feedback about what they're hearing and what it means to them. And one thing that kind of came up as a question for people in some of those conversations, or sometimes was, I think, maybe a little bit, people were confused about at first in the idea of having a common platform, is this idea that, oh, well, if you all have a common platform, does that mean that you're not going to care about anything that's, specific within a ward or specific within a neighborhood, because you're thinking on all of these, kind of broader scales or something? And I think that, the common platform is really just about sort of sharing our values. And yes, there are specific policy things that, affect the whole city. But then I think a lot of being a representative at the local level is also being able to respond and support people in those very localized things, like, supporting people through the process of figuring out how to work towards getting a speed bump in their neighborhood, or, those kinds of things. And I definitely have, could tell you a lot about different blocks in Ward 1 where that's what people are looking for, or, looking for sidewalk improvements and things like that. So yes, I think that is another really strength of door knocking and whatnot, is being able to kind of get that sense neighborhood to neighborhood, as well as, getting to speak with individual people and hear about their unique experiences.
So how did it get started?
How did it get started? That's a great question. Like I said, I kind of got involved when all of the door knocking was starting, and I wasn't actually involved in the kind of initial process of putting the slate together. And, I wasn't so aware of it at that point, and in on that process of finding the candidates so, I can, I guess, share a little bit of what has been kind of passed down to me from talking with fellow people in the process, which, I mean, I think, the broader question of how did it start is I think that a lot of different groups and people in Ithaca have been looking towards, these local elections and everything as a part of the process of making change in our community, of taking care of each other as a community. And so I think that, that broader energy is something that flows from, a whole network of relationships and of community organizing that is, hard to pinpoint really, and all of the community organizing work that people have been doing in so many forms, and the messages that are resonating out of that. And I think specifically some groups that were involved really early on was the local chapter of Democratic Socialists of America, the Tenants Union chapter. I think those were some of the earliest groups involved in kind of saying, okay, well, what does it look like to start putting together a team that can then, be like having a connection with all different community groups, and finding candidates to run, and getting a treasurer and all the kind of official paperwork of having a campaign on the record.
So the campaigns went on and the election came, and the two who you might say had the slightly easier races because they were running for, well, they weren't unopposed. Everybody had an opponent. But in the case of the second and the fourth ward, Phoebe Brown and Jorge DeFendini had opponents who, in a sense, were afterthoughts. They came late into the race. I mean, the opponents came late. Phoebe and Jorge were there from the beginning.
Right, like I said, in the primary.
And were unopposed in the primary. So became the Democratic Party candidates. And then each one acquired, you might say, an independent opponent. And we actually weren't really sure where they came from. In fact, in the case of the fourth ward, there was some real laughing. Well, I think wasn't it you who suddenly said, hey, the fourth ward, that other fourth ward candidate voted in the first ward?
I mean, yeah. So the voting records are public, and where candidates are registered, their addresses are public. And because I know a lot of the streets in the first ward, like ins and outs, I was looking at those maps to put together the routes for volunteers to walk, early in the campaign and everything. So when I checked on the Board of Elections website to see, that my candidacy was posted when we'd gotten the petitions in for an independent candidate, I saw that I was up there, my address was listed, but there was someone who was, running in the fourth ward who was actually registered on a street address that's in the first ward. And then when we were doing our get out the vote, on election day, we got a copy of the records of who had voted in the first ward so far. And that was, again, that's publicly available information. It, of course, doesn't say who anyone voted for, but it says where they voted. And there was, that name that I recognized as being a candidate in the fourth ward who had showed up as having voted in the first ward. And, that is like technically that is technically allowed, because the election commissioner, this is actually something that I found out like way earlier in the campaign for a different reason. I was having a conversation and he happened to mention this, but that you don't actually have to live in a ward that you are campaigning in. You just have to live there by the time that you start serving in office. And so, yeah, so I mean, there's technically nothing wrong with that. I think just for a lot of people, it probably, is like something that I think would be worth asking that person, thinking about the way that different wards, people tend to have different experiences. And, I think there's questions around what does it mean to be a representative of a place and, all of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the fourth ward, there is always the question of, will the candidate be a student like the majority of the population, or a permanent resident who often feel that they have more of a right to rule the roost than the students do, even though permanent residents are a minority in the fourth ward.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting question. I think given the student population in so many parts of Ithaca, but the fourth ward, of course, is such a heightened example of that, because the wards their size is designated based on how many people live there. But then within that, there's all different experiences in terms of how many people actually show up to vote there. And so in the fourth ward, you have about a seventh of the population that voted in the first ward, for example. So in the fourth ward, only about 100, I think a few more than 100 people voted in this past election.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that also kind of raises some questions about, the full like representativeness of our democracy. If there's all these, folks who aren't showing up to vote for whatever reasons, but I would encourage students to think about, registering to vote where you live, and paying attention to what's happening in local races. I think the example of the fact that, Ithaca is 70% tenants, right? And on Common Council, as of, there was this window of time a few months ago where we had 0 alder people who were tenants, right? And now with this recent election, we're gaining a few, but it still is not representative in that way.
Certainly. Well, do you think that the candidates, that the two who won will be able to have an effect on council?
Yes, so my short answer is yes. But I think again, it's interesting the kinds of questions that we're used to asking around elections and around representatives, because I think it's less, are they going to be able to have an effect? Are these individuals who we've now put in this position of power, are they going to be able to have an effect? But more, what effects can we all have now that, yes, they are in office, but now that also, more importantly, we're just building this momentum and energy about the kinds of changes we can collectively see through Common Council when more and more people continue to show up as a community and be part of that process. And I do think that, the slate running these campaigns and, all of the reaching out and connecting that we've been doing with different organizations and with, people in all of these door knocking conversations and all of that, I think is kind of drumming up a whole bunch of hope and energy for different groups working in Ithaca. I think more and more tenants have gotten connected to each other through this process. I think climate justice movements are, extra energized, usually very energized to begin with, but extra energized, just naming a couple of areas. And, and that all of that being said, I think having people on the council who have come from all of that, who understand, these grassroots experiences and community organizing. I think it is hugely important because it means that, they're in a position they can introduce resolutions. They can also, really speak to a whole slew of issues as the council is discussing things in real time, in those spaces that, rather than just a lot of perspectives maybe being considered in public comments, but then a lot of people having experiences of not really being heard beyond that. And, I think in terms of what that can look like, specifically in terms of policies and whatnot, I'd love to see expanded public transportation and housing policies like the right to renew leases, and making sure that we're funding proactive ways of keeping people safe in our community by making sure we are reducing poverty, that we have anti-violent community-based responses to things. And, people can go to the website to see more about the platform specifics, but I think really having Jorge and Phoebe, and both of them are just like, incredibly amazing people, and incredibly, put an incredible amount of care into the work that they do, and into really like bringing forth their values and building community. And so I think that they're, now in a position to be building positive relationships with other people on the council as well, to help, work towards these voting outcomes that, along with all that energy coming from people showing up in that process, like I said, I think we're all going to be able to work for things that, start really, really working for working class people, tenants, people of color, and really all of the people that our systems in the US have kind of always been designed against.
Well, thank you, Maddie Halpert.
Thank you, Theresa Alt.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
2, 1, 2, 3.